Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Anna Busa. I'm the director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, and it is my great pleasure to introduce today Eric Bleich, who is a professor of political science at Middlebury College. He's an expert on race, ethnicity, racism, and how these collide with liberal democratic freedoms. In his first book, Race, Politics in Britain and France, Eric explored how distinct ideas regarding race and policymaking explain differences in how each country dealt with race politics. His second book, Freedom to be Racist, examined how liberal democracies balance freedoms of speech and association with the goals of promoting racial tolerance and coexistence. He's also published dozens of articles on the response to Muslim violence, racist associations, the political framing of race, hate crimes, and immigrant integration. And so it is with great pleasure today that we welcome him to deliver his talk on Let Freedom Ring, Ethnic Diversity and the Politics of Values in Today's Europe. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you. I want to, first of all, thank everybody for coming on this sunny spring day. It's hard to compete with good weather, so I appreciate your diligence and commitment to learning. I also want to thank Anna and the Weiser Center for inviting me and Julia for arranging the particulars of the invitation. It feels almost like a homecoming here, even though I'm actually not from Michigan. I grew up in Wisconsin, and my wife is from outside Toledo. So coming from Vermont, it's nice to be back in the Midwest. Looking around this room, I feel like I know you, right? Being from the Midwest. Looking around this room, I would say that most people here are probably in favor of freedom. Right. How many people in this room are not in favor of freedom? Raise your hand if you're not in favor of freedom. All right, there's always one contrarian. Nice, I can count on it everywhere I go. I didn't expect a lot of hands because when I put it like that, what's not to like, right? Why would you not like freedom? Freedom's a core value for political philosophers, and it's a core value for citizens in democracies, which means for us. But by evoking freedom in the title of my talk and by starting this way, it was also a deliberate and a strategic choice. I was priming you by framing freedom as the core value through which you will now be invited to interpret everything that follows. Doing this emphasizes freedom, but it also de-emphasizes other political values. Freedom as one value, but equality, dignity, human rights, the rule of law, solidarity, opportunity, fairness, and some others are also important values in liberal democracies, core values in liberal democracies. And sometimes these values are not at all in conflict with freedom. Sometimes they're perfectly compatible, but there are times where these values do come into open conflict with values of freedom, or at least certain kinds of freedom. So today I'm going to look at three topics in the politics of diversity in contemporary Europe, and I'm going to look at them through this lens of freedom. I'm going to look at freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of movement. And I want to show three things. First, that invoking freedom is a more powerful rhetorical tool in some domains than it is in others. Second, that invoking freedom is often a strategic and a political choice, not just a philosophical choice. Actors that support freedom in one domain don't necessarily support it in other domains. And they may, in fact, be supporting freedom as a sort of mask for other values they hold that they don't want in the forefront of your mind. They also may be avoiding talking about freedom because they want to focus your attention on some other value, on some other outcome. Third, and finally, in all of these discussions, freedom is always balanced against other key values. And it is not the master value that we sometimes think it is. So recognizing this forces us to weigh up the multiple values at stake when we're talking about the politics of diversity. I'm going to start with freedom of speech issues and also with a little bit of comparative context. Freedom has always been the dominant value in discussions of speech restrictions in the United States. The Supreme Court interpretation of the First Amendment is very focused on freedom. It's very expansive. It protects many kinds of speech delivered by many kinds of actors. Some of them, particularly corporations, are somewhat surprising for some observers. And people on the right and the left generally support freedom of speech, even if that means allowing racist speech. You can stand up and say virtually any racist thing you want in the United States in public, and that is your legal right. Right? You may suffer some social sanctions for that, but the police will not come knocking at your door. Right? Legally, you are protected from the state. European countries take a different approach to freedom of speech, especially regarding racist speech. Freedom of speech is a core European value. Right? Let there be no mistake. It's something that Europeans hold very dear. But every country in Europe that I know about has passed some form of law against racist insult, defamation, or incitement. Right? Those are the three categories of speech that are more prohibited in Europe than in the United States. And by racist here, I mean directed at people on the grounds of what we would call race, but also more broadly on the grounds of religion or ethnicity or national origin. Some countries also have penalties for Holocaust denial or for more generic genocide denial. So if you call somebody a dirty Arab, or say Muslims are a cancer that need to be cut out of our country, or say the Holocaust is a myth, these are all real examples, there is a chance that you could be charged with a crime. The police might come knocking on your door. In most cases, the penalties for these kinds of crimes would be a fine. In some cases, if the circumstances were particularly aggravated, you might get a suspended sentence. But there are instances where people have served jail time for these kinds of speech. Just ask David Irving. David Irving is a British historian who is also a notorious Holocaust denier. He was active in a lot of countries in the 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2000s. In 2005, he was arrested and spent 13 months in an Austrian jail because he said there were no gas chambers in Auschwitz. All witnesses who claim otherwise are psychiatric cases. Going to jail for expressing an opinion is something that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. So the stakes here are pretty high. And these kinds of public mediatized trials generate a lot of attention, and a lot of attention to the freedom of speech implications. And I think this seems pretty logical and in many ways apolitical from an American point of view. Most Americans would support free speech. Most Americans would not be in favor of a law that penalizes Holocaust denial. But this debate is not wholly apolitical in Europe. Many of the people who make the loudest arguments for free speech in Europe are on the far right of the political spectrum. For example, Ernst Zundel, another notorious Holocaust denier, dramatically shouldered a giant cross labeled freedom of speech the day he was sentenced by a Canadian court. He later spent 3 years in a German prison for Holocaust denial. So he had a real stake in wanting people to see his case through this free speech lens. Jean-Marie Le Pen, I love this picture. Doesn't this give you a really good sense of who he is? Jean-Marie Le Pen, the former leader of France's Front National party, is also an ardent advocate of free speech. Why? Well, he's been convicted several times for racist speech. He said, for example, that the Holocaust was a mere detail of the history of the Second World War, and that when France has 25 million Muslims, non-Muslim French citizens will have to hug the wall as they go by or get a beating. It's not just the far right that advocates for freedom of speech, of course. Center-right journalists in Denmark were the ones that led the charge in publishing the Mohammed cartoons in the name of promoting free speech. And other journalists in other European countries republished those cartoons when violence broke out in 2006. Mainstream non-political historians have complained in a number of countries about Holocaust denial laws and the freedom to write about history as they see fit. And left-wing journalists and cartoonists working at places like Charlie Hebdo also insist on broad interpretations of freedom of speech. They want to insult everybody, basically. Still, actors with a far-right or racist agenda have been particularly prone to invoke freedom of speech as a value. And I want to give one extended example of this. French performer Dieudonné Mbalaba. How many people have heard of Dieudonné? How many people have read about him or heard about him? Okay, not a ton. He's a pretty prominent figure in the news these days in France. He got his start working as a comedian, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years ago, working in a duo with a Jewish partner. But since that time, he's dropped his partner and has become an active anti-Semite. After the Charlie Hebdo events of January 2015, he was arrested and convicted for a post, I think it was a Facebook post, a social media post, in which he claimed he felt like Charlie Koulibaly. Right? That was a mixed reference to Charlie Hebdo and to Amadi Koulibaly, who was the gunman who shot 4 Jews in a kosher market 2 days after the Charlie Hebdo massacre. Seemed to be a way of saying, I'm being persecuted for exercising objectionable free speech, while at the same time sympathizing with a man who killed Jews. Dieudonné actually has a long history of making these kinds of provocative statements. He was convicted notably for a 2008 performance where he invited a famous French Holocaust denier, not David Irving, not Ernst Zundel, another one, there are a number of them, onto stage and gave this guy a mock award for untouchability and insolence. In 2014, French authorities judged his shows contained so much anti-Semitism that they banned his performances. Right? This, in U.S. terms, is considered is prior restraint, which is considered a big red flag in terms of restricting speech. Typically, what you do is you allow the speech and then punish it afterwards. But here, the French authorities said, we're not even allowing him to go on stage because we know what's in his show, and it's provocatively anti-Semitic. He's also the author of the now famous Quenelle, which for him is an anti-establishment gesture, but to others looks a lot like an inverted Nazi salute. Dieudonné in these discussions portrays himself as a victim. All I want is freedom of speech. How could you crack down on me? And this complaint has been effective with audiences, particularly with some young people who think the system is stacked against them, but also with international audiences. As recently as November 10th, 2015, a New York Times headline about a Dieudonné court decision read, "Court rules against French comedian Dieudonné in free speech case." Right? But interpreting the Dieudonné story only through the free speech lens leaves a lot of other important values out of the discussion. People who want him punished, not just anti-racists, but also prosecutors, French judges, European Court of Human Rights justices, view his speech as violating other core liberal democratic values. For these folks, the kinds of values that they are keyed in on, that they think outweigh Dieudonné's claims to free speech, are things like human dignity, racial justice, social peace. Right? So they're weighing up the benefits of free speech against these other values and making a call for the other values over free speech. Dieudonné's claim, however, is a good example of how emphasizing freedom of speech can be a calculated political act. It's an attempt to prime audiences to frame the debate in ways that focus on one key value that a lot of people care deeply about: freedom, in terms of freedom of speech. But the goal here is to defend a certain kind of speech. In other words, a certain kind of value embodied in that speech, anti-Semitism, that he doesn't want at the forefront of your minds. He couldn't stand up and say, I want the right to be anti-Semitic. That wouldn't play as well in the public debate as I want the right to freedom of speech. Right? So he is using freedom of speech and invoking freedom as a philosophical value in a calculated political strategy. And his goal is to distract you from identifying or focusing on the other values that you give up when you accede to the demand of freedom of speech. The second demand I'm going to talk about today is freedom of religion. European countries vary tremendously in how they handle religion and how much they protect religion, religious values. But 47 states have ratified the European Convention on Human Rights. This is, I would say, not a widely known document, but it is an important one. It's a pan-European, legally enforceable agreement about fundamental rights, to which any citizen of these countries can appeal if they feel that their fundamental rights are infringed upon, even at the national level. The European Court of Human Rights has the power to rule that states have infringed those fundamental rights and to overturn those decisions or to provide some sort of compensation to the victim if they have been, if their rights have been violated. And the convention is pretty explicit that freedom of religion is a core right. By the way, freedom of speech is Article 10, is embodied in Article 10. Freedom of religion, Article 9. They thought of freedom of religion even before freedom of speech, or at least they wrote it down in that order. Article 9.1 says everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes the freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in worship, teaching, practice, and observance. And I pause over these words because we're going to come back to see how this is applied in practice. I'm going to focus today on how some Muslims have appealed to principles of freedom of religion, and in particular to how they have reacted to laws and policies that restrict their ability to wear garments that cover their face. Just for starters, it's important to know that Muslims have reacted very differently to these laws and policies. There are about 4.7 million Muslims in France and about 17.5 million Muslims in the major West European countries. They don't all speak with one voice, far from it. Some don't care about these laws. Some actually embrace these laws. But it's perhaps not surprising that some have opposed these laws and opposed these restrictions. These folks have attempted to frame headscarf or burqa debates in terms of freedom of religion, both in the court of public opinion and in real courts at the national and at the European levels. Most non-Muslims have avoided talking about freedom of religion. They emphasize other societal values and other societal goals. In France, for example, the public discussion has centered around laïcité. Laïcité is a little bit like the American concept of separation of church and state, except in the United States, the notion is more that, separation of church and state is important because it protects people and their religions from interference by the state. In France, the triangular dynamic is a little bit different. The notion is laïcité protects the state and the individuals from the interference of religion. Right, so both care about this relationship between the state, religion, and the individual, but they focus on a slightly different version of where the threat comes from. Religion in France is something that you are allowed to have, but you're supposed to do it outside of the realm of the state. So the justification for banning headscarves in French schools in 2004 was that schools are in the state domain. They're in the state sphere. So you have to get religion out of the state sphere. You have to protect the state and individuals from religion in that sphere. But France has also gone beyond regulating religious dress in the state sphere. In 2008, France's Supreme Court for Administrative Law, the Conseil d'État, upheld a 2005 decision to deny citizenship to an immigrant. This doesn't seem like a big deal until you realize that the immigrant was legally admitted to France, spoke fluent French, was married to a French citizen, and had French children born on French soil. That's about as French as you can be without being a citizen. So why wouldn't they grant her citizenship? Because she showed up to her naturalization interview in a burqa. She also said that she believed that she needed to submit to her husband's authority in the house. You may or may not embrace those things. You don't have to. But the point here is that her religious practice was clearly not in the state sphere. It was very much in the private sphere. But the state denied her citizenship on the grounds that, quote, she had adopted a radical practice of her religion incompatible with the essential values of the French community, especially the principle of equality between the sexes. So assimilation outweighed freedom of religion. And in particular, the value of equality of the sexes was more important than freedom of religion in the estimation of the Conseil d'État in this case. There were almost no public voices at that time that spoke up for freedom of religion. The headline in Le Monde afterwards was not "Court rules against French woman in freedom of religion case." Right? That would be the parallel to the Dieudonné example. It was French nationality refused to a Moroccan in a burqa. And the feminist activist group Ni Pute Ni Soumise heralded the rule by saying, "The Republic can in no manner validate this kind of tool of oppression and submission of women." And even though many arch-conservatives in France are practicing Catholics and may not be the most ardent advocates of equality of the sexes, they did not rally behind the cause of freedom of religion in this case. And it's not just through administrative decisions where the French state has limited freedom of religion. In 2010, as some of you probably know, the French Parliament passed a law forbidding facial concealment in public. This law didn't make mention of Islam explicitly, but everybody knew this was about banning burqas and niqabs in public spaces. Public spaces, which of course are exactly the spaces where they are intended to be worn, and more importantly, public spaces are not state spaces. Right? Those are different spaces. So wearing a burqa or niqab in public does not contravene principles of laïcité. And after the law was passed, one Muslim woman went directly to the European Court of Human Rights. She complained that the law violated a number of basic human rights. The most important one was freedom of religion. And as you know, Article 9.1 of the European Convention on Human Rights upholds the freedom of religion. But Article 9.2 says, wait a minute, there can be some limits. Right? This is not an unlimited right. It says, freedom to manifest one's religion or belief shall be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society in the interests of public safety for the protection of public order, health, or morals, or the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. In other words, European human rights law acknowledges competing values that may limit the freedom of religion. So in defending itself, the French state was forced to articulate its rationale in terms that could be justified by Article 9.2 of the European Convention. It said that the law served the interests of public safety and that it was for the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. What did the European Court of Human Rights say? It found that there could be a public safety justification for banning burqas and niqabs, but only if there were a widespread general threat. And in France in 2013, the court said there was no need to ban all face coverings because if there were a threat or suspicion about any individual, the police had the right to stop that individual and ask that individual as an individual to take off their face covering. Right? So it said we don't buy the public safety rationale. Under the banner of protection of the rights and freedoms of others, France made three specific arguments. That the law was necessary to protect gender equality, that it protected human dignity, and that it promoted the ability of people in society to live together, or vivre ensemble. And I'm going to give away the end of the story here. This is a spoiler alert, and say that the European Court upheld the French law. Why did it do that? Right? What argument did it buy? Which values that the French state identified convinced the court that it was justifiable to limit freedom of religion in this case? It wasn't gender equality, and it wasn't human dignity. The court dismissed those justifications. Instead, it relied on the admittedly vague notion of vivre ensemble, the ability of people to live together in society. It said that in a country where looking someone in the face was generally understood to be a fundamental part of social interactions, France was allowed to ban face coverings that it felt breached the right of others to live in a space of socialization which made living together easier. I think that this discussion about freedom of religion shows a few key things. First, Muslims were largely unsuccessful in framing the public debate in terms of freedom of religion. They found almost no allies in the French public sphere arguing that their freedom of religion was the most important value to consider in this debate. But second, they were able to use the fact that this value of freedom of religion was embedded in the European Convention on Human Rights, European-wide human rights agreements, as a way to take their case to court. This forced the French government to articulate which values it felt outweighed freedom of religion. Some of these values, like public safety or gender equality, played quite well to a domestic political audience, but they didn't work at the European court level. However, the court found a different value to lean on to justify upholding the law. So here we get, I think, a really good sense of how invoking certain values and avoiding discussing other values is both a political and a legal strategy in some of these cases. Finally, and maybe this is obvious, many of those who stood most strongly for freedom of speech did not stand up and advocate for freedom of religion in these cases. Neither the far right nor Charlie Hebdo sympathizers were on the front lines arguing for freedom of religion in this case. Just like most Muslim groups speaking up in these debates were not on the front line defending freedom of speech for Charlie Hebdo or for far-right actors. Very few people value freedom above all values in all circumstances, because freedom is just one core value among many that we hold and that we trade off depending on the issue at hand. The last type of freedom I want to talk about today is freedom of movement. It's a freedom that we hear a lot less about than freedom of speech or even freedom of religion. And in some ways, freedom of movement is a freedom that we take for granted if we're talking about freedom of movement within a country, right? I took for granted that I could get on a plane from Vermont yesterday and fly to Michigan, no problem, right? You can drive to Ohio. You can go to Cedar Point. There's a nice little local reference for you. It's about all I got, really. Doing the best I can up here. You take it for granted if it's within a country, but it's also a freedom in some ways that we don't think exists when national borders are in play, right? You don't assume that you can just go to Canada without showing a passport, without going through a control at the border. But there are two ways in which freedom of movement across borders is an especially relevant value in Europe. After World War II, European countries actually led the way in establishing protections for refugees. The 1951 UN Convention on the Status of Refugees grew out of problems within Europe, problems that involved Europeans in Europe. Any country that signs this convention agrees to accept refugees fleeing persecution in their home country. And there are all sorts of legal and political debates about who is a refugee and who is just a migrant. But the principles of opening borders, even when it is against national interests, are established in international law, and especially established within Europe. On a second level, European Union members have promoted freedom of movement for economic reasons. Freedom of movement for EU member citizens has been a core principle since the founding of the European Economic Community in the 1950s, because a mobile workforce enhances the economies of Europe. And since signing the Schengen Agreement in 1985, many EU countries and some others have also eliminated border controls between them. There are now 26 Schengen countries between which you can drive, walk, bicycle, fly, paraglide, whatever you want, without going through any sort of border check. Well, used to be the case. Freedom of movement across international borders is actually more established than we may think, and more established in Europe than almost anywhere else. But as you know, this freedom has been dramatically limited in the past 6 months. Countries have begun sealing their borders, putting up barbed wire, physically restraining migrants and refugees. And I think these images show that limiting freedom of movement has some real human costs. These limits are historic steps. If you'd asked EU experts a year ago, would you imagine that a year from now there would be reintroduced borders with barbed wire between Schengen countries? They would have said, no way. Right? It was just taken for granted that you could move freely between these countries. Imagine going through a barbed wire checkpoint trying to get to Cedar Point. Right? It just doesn't compute. It seems ridiculous to think of it that way. And you know what caused this? The influx of more than 1 million people in 2015, with hundreds of thousands more projected to arrive in the coming months. As these refugees arrive and as Europeans panic, what role does invoking freedom play in debates across Europe? The answer is not much of a role. When President of the European Council Donald Tusk worried about saving the EU's Schengen rules on free movement last November, it wasn't a broad moral appeal to the principle of freedom of movement. It was a bureaucratic concern about an established rule. Freedom of movement has a very little intrinsic moral power in these debates. In fact, freedom of movement is seen as generating very practical problems. The combination of allowing in large numbers of refugees and allowing free movement within the Schengen zone means that hundreds of thousands of people have been moving to get to the places they want to go, principally Germany, also Sweden. These have been the most welcoming countries in Europe. But migrants have also been setting up camps on the edge of the English Channel in Calais in great numbers. They're trying to get to Great Britain, which is not a Schengen country. It's not part of the Schengen zone. And so freedom of movement has also created a slightly different practical problem for France, which just physically tore down part of this camp earlier this month. Destination countries and transit countries worry mostly about the expenses involved and about problems of public order. In fact, public order has become the major justification for restricting freedom of movement in European countries. Even Sweden imposed border controls in 2015. Sweden, that has taken in more refugees per capita than Germany, than any other country. And it did this because of concerns about public order, or what it called stability and security. The fact that one of the Paris bombers entered Europe by crossing from Turkey to Greece only increases concern about public safety issues related to refugee movements. Some politicians, other politicians, worry more about the cultural impact of this flow of migrants, the cultural impact or social cohesion. This means mostly how will we settle tens of thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands of principally Muslim migrants in our country. In Slovakia, leaders have wondered, quote, why would Muslims want to come here since we don't have any mosques? In Hungary, the prime minister said that the local Jewish community might fear a large Muslim influx. So these are concerns about social cohesion, about social order. And although there are lots of people in Europe who are committed to preserving open borders, who are committed to welcoming refugees in large numbers, just think about Angela Merkel, or at least the Angela Merkel of last September, before politics kicked in. Appealing to the principle of freedom of movement across borders is not an effective political strategy for advancing this agenda. It's a type of freedom that is less rooted in public discussions and less embedded in international law than freedom of speech or freedom of religion. So to the extent that politicians or public figures invoke values of openness, they're more likely to do it by appealing to human rights or human dignity or the rule of law obligations of refugee conventions. And these are countered most frequently not by appeals to values, but by assertions of national interest, of economic hardship, or of public order. So in the end, reviewing these recent developments in the politics of diversity in Europe brings me back to the 3 points I talked about in the introduction. First, freedom is a value that's more powerful in some debates than in others. Freedom of speech carries a lot of weight. Freedom of movement does not carry nearly as much weight. So certain kinds of freedom are going to be more important to people than other kinds. Second, arguments for freedom or deliberately avoiding arguments about freedom can be a political strategy. It primes listeners and frames the debate in a way that can mobilize support for your position. And it can demobilize or delegitimize support for the opposite position. So used in this way, these arguments are not motivated just by a philosophical adherence to the principle of freedom. Finally, no matter what the debate, freedom is always balanced against other important values. So if you are for freedom, what values are you trading off? What are you giving up? Dignity, equality, anti-racism, social stability. I've tried to show here today how these points are relevant to discussions about the politics of diversity in Europe, but I think they're also relevant to the politics of diversity in the United States. Debates about Halloween costume emails, debates about when and where Trump 2016 can be chalked onto sidewalks. The hyperbole about freedom of expression on college campuses can be read in much the same way as I've read these debates in the European context. These are not always just pure philosophical positions. Is that Trump calling?
That's Trump calling.
To complain? These may also be political positions, and they may take your attention away from other core values that you care about deeply. So if you want to think carefully about where you stand, it's helpful to look for the values underlying any particular position on these issues and to weigh all the values at stake, the ones being discussed and also the ones that are absent from the discussion. Thank you. Nice. The freedom to ask. Yes.
I'm a little bit confused as to why the banning of the niqab is controversial, because the face of like in
Well, as I pointed out, Muslims in Europe come in many varieties, and there are some who would say, yeah, it's not controversial. I would agree that it could be banned or should be banned. But if you remember the text of the European Convention, it essentially says you can do whatever you want, right? There are, you have the right to, in public or in private, manifest your religion or belief basically however you want. So if somebody is saying, I as an observant Muslim believe that it is my right or my duty or my wish to wear the niqab or the burqa, for the state to come in and say, no, you may not do that, contravenes one core principle of the freedom of religion that's embedded in European-wide conventions.
Just to be devil's advocate, then, can't the other people say that, this person is wearing a car and doing face veil? That is a freedom of my right to identify and have an equal, that everyone is identified by faith. So a person wears a balaclava and walks in the street, they can easily say that this is mine, I mean, a priest probably is going to be devil's advocate here. I'm trying to think, because if the religious authority in Al-Azhar and in Saudi Arabia, they say that it's banned, you're not wearing a face veil during the Hajj and Umrah, I don't see that's a big, reasonable thing, it's banned.
Well, so the argument that you're making against the right to wear it is essentially the argument that the French state made. One of the many arguments that the French state made. It sort of said, we're throwing a bunch of alternative rights up here on the wall, and we're going to see which ones stick, which ones persuade the European Court of Human Rights. And the one that stuck, the one that worked, was this notion that in a society like France, where being able to look at people's faces was key to social communication, wearing something that covered your face was possible to ban that. Now, of course, there are other people who, I mean, one of the examples, counterexamples that people gave was motorcycle helmets, right? Tinted motorcycle helmets. Why should you be allowed to wear those, right? So there are lots of ways in which you could play this out with specific examples that raise some questions about the honesty or earnestness of these kinds of positions. It never was a problem in French society until you got to women wearing face coverings. Yes?
First things first, my name is Sita. I have two questions. One, you mentioned briefly that you can see counter support from two sides of the aisle, and I was wondering if there's more to say about that, because they're finding themselves as these strange bedfellows in a way, where Le Pen and the Muslims both appeal to the same arguments. That could be a source of weird and temporal political coalitions in one scenario, advancing certain rulings or stuff like that. And on the other hand, it could also cool down their use of these arguments, or it could just create this dissonance that they live peacefully with. So I was wondering if you can say something on that. And the second question is, another right that I've seen invoked in the U.S., and I wonder if it appears in Europe as well, is freedom of privacy, especially recently with the Snowden revealings and all that. And I was wondering if you identify that as well as something as part of this thing.
Yeah, so the strange bedfellows do exist, but they're more in terms of specified domains. So in terms of freedom of speech, you have the far-right anti-Semites, and you have the Charlie Hebdo far left, we want to insult everybody. But you also have people, on the conservative Catholic right who sue Charlie Hebdo for anti-Pope cartoons, right? So the bedfellows don't line up completely easily, even in one domain. But I would say you don't have the strange bedfellows across the domains, right? That's where my fundamental argument is. You may think that freedom is a critical value when speech issues are at the forefront of your mind. But then if we start talking about freedom of religion, it may seem like freedom may seem like a far less critical value compared to some other values that you may hold more dearly. So you don't see the strange bedfellows across the domains all that much. And I would say on the political right, on the political left, and the political center, there are very few actors that I can think of in Europe who hold a consistently kind of libertarian perspective. Freedom here, freedom there, freedom everywhere. That's my core value. It's more a mix and match approach. On the privacy question, I think the right to privacy is something that is held quite strongly in the European context, but it's not framed so much in terms of debates about freedom, right? It's much more along the lines of kind of human dignity, like the right to personhood. So it doesn't really, I struggle to think about a way in which people enter that debate with freedom at the forefront of their mind. Yeah.
So I find the contradictions really interesting, and we were talking about this earlier, but whether you could help us think through, for example, the example in your book that you give that Richard Bardot has been charged with racism by the French government repeatedly because he says anti-Muslim statements, and then at the same time, a law being passed banning his job. So how to think about, on the one hand, France trying to create a multicultural environment through these hate speech laws, and then on the other hand, seems to be marginalizing multiculturalism through banning his job.
Yeah. It's a great question. It's not the first time I've been asked that question, and I still feel like I'm kind of groping towards an answer, so I don't think I have a perfect answer for it. But I think that the restrictions on hate speech are seen to be a kind of self-contained domain where there are certain anti-racist associations that advocate for punishing racist hate speech. They tend to focus on prototypical minorities as victims of hate speech. So that includes Jews, but it also includes Muslims and Arabs and Algerians and blacks and Africans. And this group that are seen to be the most vulnerable in society are seen to be particularly vulnerable to hate speech. And there's an associative life surrounding pressure to restrict those kinds of attacks. However, the wearing of the burqa or the headscarf even, is seen to not be so much a debate about racism as it is framed in terms of laïcité. Right? So here we have these kinds of separate and parallel domains again, where there are people who are willing to restrict freedom of speech in the name of promoting anti-racism, but they're not willing to stand up for freedom of religion in terms of promoting multiculturalism, at least not uniformly. Right, so once you see these as separate domains in the way that French public life is organized and French associations are organized, it becomes a little easier to understand why they push so hard to protect against anti-Muslim speech over here, and then just sort of let the burqa ban and the headscarf ban go over here. I'm getting there. It's probably better than I've ever explained it before. I'm not sure if it's good enough, but it's getting there. Yes.
I noticed you contrasted Europe with examples from the U.S. on matters of free speech, but you didn't do so on matters of freedom of religion. Now, the U.S. doesn't have the equivalent of Article 922, and so there tends to be an absolutist interpretation of freedom of religion at this point as expedient. So, have you thought about that as contrasted with Europe?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'll be honest and say that I haven't really looked into that very much. My book is more on the speech side, so the religion side is an area that I'm moving into, and I'm more of a Europeanist than an Americanist. So although I'm familiar with some of the developments and debates in the United States about freedom of religion, I wouldn't claim to be knowledgeable about them enough to really make that comparison here, but I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. I mean, I think in France and in Europe, the notion of freedom of religion is applied very differently country by country, right? So the European Convention says 9.1, 9.2, here's what we have to say. And any individual can appeal beyond the national level to that European level convention. But Germany, Britain, France, they deal with religious issues very differently even within Europe. So there's less uniformity from within European countries than there is in terms of the freedom of speech angle, where almost every country does have restrictions on freedom of speech. Yeah.
You included solidarity among one of the freedoms in your original list. And it occurs to me that whenever
encroaching on their thinking about all sorts of freedoms, about policing and those sorts of things. Why did you include solidarity in the list, and what is your view of it?
I included solidarity in the list. I mean, I think solidarity is a value that has different meanings in different contexts, right? So if you think of Sweden and the notion of solidarity, it's a little bit different from the context where I was thinking, which was more like France and the concept of fraternité, right? We are all equal citizens in this together, and we're supposed to all be treated equally. So the concept of solidarity probably has slightly different meanings depending on which country you're looking at. But I think you're right. You know, challenges to solidarity can elicit very strong reactions. And for me, the key challenge is when you're willing to frame a debate in terms of one value, or when you prioritize one value in your framing of a particular debate, you want to pay attention to what's being sidelined, the other values that you're kind of pushing off the table or out of the range of vision. So solidarity for me is one of these values that's not often talked about, but it is in there in many European countries as something that is a core social value. Does that answer your question?
It answers it.
A follow-up?
Well, it seems to me then that, in a way, it encapsulates all of the other freedoms. And I wonder if it deserves to be set apart as a category.
I don't think so, right? And I think, you know, part of the way that I look at these things is in a liberal democracy, we all have different opinions about which values matter and which values matter most. So it may be that for you, solidarity is the master value, or a value that somehow encompasses all the other ones, maybe more important, or maybe should be and should enter into every debate that we have. But I don't assume that that's true for anybody else in this room. It may be true for some other people in this room. It's probably not true for everybody in this room. So I think where I am kind of nudging my listeners is to say, whenever you hear something framed in terms of one value, keep in mind that we have other values, and you may be, if you accept the terms of the debate, that this is a debate about solidarity, or this is a debate about freedom, then you're missing out on kind of the ability to weigh up the values that are important to you. Once we as individuals have weighed up the values on our own terms, so for you it's solidarity, for somebody else it's fraternity, for somebody else it's freedom, then we enter into a space where we negotiate and discuss, okay, what do we do with this concrete problem given that we hold these multiple values? And I'm a little surprised that nobody has bit on the American bone that I threw in at the end. This is such a hot topic, and it's going on campuses right now. Right? Do we uphold freedom of speech? Is that the most important value we have? Do we uphold the value of what? It's framed in different ways depending on the context, but valuing diversity, tolerance, not trying to harm people who maybe feel like they're in an attacked position. You know, what are your values? I think we enter into these debates often accepting the terms that we are given rather than exploring the multiple values that we might think of as the most important ones in any given debate. Yes?
So this, I'm starting to just sort of think through this. I mean, I've got the ideas about it, but I'm not sure that I am going to articulate this clearly. But I was struck by, so you sort of identified three kind of major freedoms, that freedom of speech, freedom of organization, freedom of religion. And then you said that in your kind of explication, what sort of comes through is that the
Okay, there's a lot in there. I'll see if I can follow it along. The reason I put them together and the reason I focus on freedom instead of something like solidarity, right? You could imagine this talk being let solidarity ring. I don't know, that doesn't quite sound the same, but you get the point. Is when I talk about these kinds of things in my work, the feedback I get often mostly from an American audience, not always from a scholarly audience, but from a more public audience, is freedom of speech all the way. Like, that freedom is the most important value that we hold in the United States. It is the master value, and everything else comes second to that. So I wanted to explore essentially how true is it that freedom is a master value in a variety of contexts. So looking to Europe as a first move is a way to juxtapose, the Europeans don't think the same way that Americans do on average. Even within Europe, there are domains where freedom is more like, I wouldn't even say a master value in terms of freedom of speech, because in Europe they balance out freedom of speech against other key values. But then comparing it to freedom of religion and freedom of movement, where you move down the scale of the salience of that value as being the most important value, emphasizes the point, the bigger point I want to make also to an American audience, that we all hold multiple values and we want to be aware of what they are, and we don't want to just accept the terms that this value is the one that frames the debate and the way that we think about this particular issue that we're confronted with today. So the using Europe and the using the multiple domains shows kind of stepwise declines in the value of freedom, gives the full range of importance of the value of freedom, or a wide range of the importance of the value of freedom. So that's why I think they make a nice match. What does it say about diversity politics more generally? I think it also opens up this notion that there are some domains where, if you go back to the list of values that I gave, equality, some form of diversity plus equality is going to be a really important value in some domains, and less important in others, and really not seen as very important in others. And I think this was partly my response to Evelyn, although I was much more on the institutional front, right? Protecting minorities against racist hate speech in Europe is seen as a more important value, right? Protecting diversity. In terms of religion, it's seen as less important, certainly in France, in general probably in other countries too. So if you picked any one of these values, you could probably pick different domains and show that in some places the value is quite strong, in others it's sort of medium strong, and in others it's not that strong.
Exercise my privilege.
So it strikes me, is this really a conflict between freedom and other values, or is it just different interpretations of freedom, right? I mean, freedom is actually a loose, baggy concept. So your freedom of expression might violate my freedom to live in peace, or my freedom to pursue my own happiness. You know why?
Yeah, and I would say that that's a good point, because sometimes what people do when somebody frames something in terms of freedom of speech and they want to promote values of something like diversity or equality, but they recognize that freedom is a more powerful word in the context of that debate, they'll reframe their values in terms of freedom, right? Freedom to live the way we want to live, right? Something like that. So you can frame almost any debate in terms of freedom, as you just suggested, but that I think also reinforces my point that it's more a rhetorical tool in those instances than some sort of deep adherence to the philosophical value of freedom for its own sake and in some sort of pure term.
What would that look like, this sort of pure adherence to a pure version?
Well, I think in terms of negative freedom, you can think of like libertarians as saying essentially that's our primary value, and we're going to apply it as consistently as we can in every domain of life that we can think of. Yeah.
I was hoping you could talk more about what's currently going on universities and college campuses in the United States right now, and what that says about the role of universities and the civic education of students, the state of that civic education?
Yeah, all right. I'm glad you asked. I,
I write a paper, so help me out.
yeah, okay, here you go. Take some notes. I think the way this is playing out is it really fits well with the analysis I've given, which is there are some people who are claiming freedom of speech is the master value and should, I was going to say trump, but perhaps I should avoid that word in this circumstance, should come before any other value. And the political reaction to that, I mean, the political action and reaction go both ways, but the other side of that debate is often framed in terms of essentially dignity, right? We have the right to be here and be respected and not feel like we are being attacked, verbally attacked, right? So that's the debate that's going on, and those are often the terms of the debate on college campuses right now, though the dignity part takes different forms, right? Different terms are used. And from my perspective, if you accept the way that I look at the world, which you're free not to do, the idea is, what we ideally want to do is to get people to sort of say, look, we hold multiple values dear at the same time. And the challenge is when these values do come in conflict, right? So Anna's point about you can frame anything in terms of freedom is true, but there are still these underlying conflicts where you can't have two different conflicting kinds of freedom at the same time. So you may call it freedom versus freedom, others may call it freedom versus dignity, right? But it's the same problem. And so how do you engage a community, in this case a college community, in a debate that shows that we hold multiple values dear and negotiate a way, the best way we can, to allow the maximum of both of those values at the same time. And I think the shouting back and forth between we want freedom at any cost or we want dignity and protection no matter what the cost of freedom of speech is entirely counterproductive, right? So this is a plug for viewing the debate in more nuanced terms and potentially opening up a space for dialogue instead of simple yelling back and forth. Yeah.
This is a kind of challenging question.
Aren't they all?
So I know that in Europe we value freedom of speech very highly, but seeing Europe's history of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, how do you monitor that freedom of speech that gives rise to extremely high levels of anti-Semitism that you see in the younger generation? So I know older generation of parents who come from Morocco, Turkey, and they face much more challenges than the younger group. I mean, they had a poverty background. But when they did surveys on their level of anti-Semitism, the numbers were much lower than the younger kids who were born in the European countries and who had way more opportunities than their parents themselves. And their rates of anti-Semitism would, neo-Nazis push. It's a seriously high level, 80%, very high levels of anti-Semitism. So how do you, and then, a lot of universities, they have the problem in Belgium, a lot of radicals teaching used to go to university. So there's like a YouTube video where radicals being criticized, how many do you believe in the Sharia cutting off hands? And all the, young kids are just raising their hands. So this is very alarming because this freedom of speech is causing someone else's, like another religious group, like the Jewish people, it's infringing on their rights to have a future, a safe future. So how do you, handle those people? Because those radical teachers, they say, freedom of speech, they try and leave that banner. But ultimately, the rates are going to be extremely high.
Yeah. I mean, so as I said earlier, I think, if the U.S. protection of freedom of speech is here, Europe, it's here. It's a core value, but it's seen as one among many. And certainly it's true that most European leaders and most European countries as a whole are very attuned to the notion that the history of the Holocaust on this continent means that we have to be more circumspect about allowing any kind of speech whatsoever, particularly anti-Semitic speech, which is seen as very problematic.
But nothing's been happening though in Europe, and the communities where it's like the local communities where this is going on.
Yeah.
You get a textbook in Virginia, and in the schools that are funded by Saudi, so openly says that you either able to read it, openly, only openly blatantly anti-Semitic, and nothing really goes on in the
Yeah. Well, I would say there are laws against forms of anti-Semitic speech and hate speech in general that preach violence or discrimination or incite hatred against groups. So if you're engaged in that kind of speech, you can and will be convicted. There are plenty of convictions every year in France, also in Germany and a number of other countries. I think another way in which they're addressing that kind of problem, because there are lots of forms of anti-Semitic speech or racist hate speech that fall short of illegal hate speech, right? And they're trying to address those kinds of problems more through school policies, right? Holocaust remembrance days, teaching the history, these sorts of things. Is it entirely successful? Are they convincing everybody not to be racist or anti-Semitic? No, right? Those are the societies that we live in. There is that kind of problem. So, radical Muslim preachers, they're monitored. They're allowed to say some things, not others. If they step over the line, they'll certainly be arrested and convicted for it. But I don't think that hate speech laws or really any tools that we have at our disposal in liberal democracies can stamp out racism. That's not really what they're for. Right? The laws themselves are saying, look, we allow you the freedom to be racist. That's the title of my book, right? But there's a limit. And beyond this limit, if you're actively inciting hatred or discrimination or violence, that's where we say it has to stop. Other than that, below that, they're dealing with it in terms of sometimes media policies, sometimes school policies, other kinds of administrative decisions. Yeah. Stuart, you had your hand up a second ago or a few minutes ago.
I think this is an area of political philosophy.
So ask a nonsensical question.
Like that has an immunity to an argument, which you're not making at the time, which is you came close to me, that so if we pushed it far enough, I am inclined now to believe the following. Actually, freedom lacks on this. We look back at political philosophy and we come up with what freedom is and a version of freedom that works, versions of freedom that have been functionally useful to political philosophy. But in modern political debate, actually, freedom is not. There are sets of values which we frame as freedom. Freedom is just a frame. And so we come up with things which are going to happen. And in some instances, when it's politically expedient, frame those things as justified by the can. That I find a very interesting possibility.
I wouldn't go quite that far. I wouldn't say that everybody who stands up in favor of freedom of speech is motivated by strategic behavior where that's just a mask for some underlying true interest or goal or value, right? Sometimes people do honestly believe in freedom in a narrow way as being the most important value in that domain, like freedom of speech. Like if you said to them, look, by granting freedom of speech, you're trading off anti-racism values, you're trading off equality, you're trading off certain other ways you could think about other kinds of freedom, they would say, okay, I'm happy to do that because freedom in this domain is truly the thing that I think is most important. That's not a mask for something else underneath it. However, I do think that there are people for whom claiming that freedom of speech is their most important value is a mask. So it's a mask often designed in Dieudonné's case, for example, to just beat up on the Jews, right? That's his goal. And so he can wear the mantle of freedom of speech and get the New York Times to frame his case in freedom of speech terms because it appeals to an audience who isn't thinking deeply enough about what's really being traded off here.
So it's not that I think that everyone who uses freedom is using it maliciously, like they have an underlying thing that is bad that they would like to see improved, so they call it freedom. They have an underlying preference, but I'm not attaching any kind of normative value to that. So I think actually that people should be allowed to say whatever they want to say. And that's my value. And I'm going to frame that when it makes for a good
I,
believe any of this yet, though. I'm just very
I see your point, but I guess I would say, what underpins the belief that I should be allowed to say whatever I want? What underpins the belief that you shouldn't say racist things? Right? I think if you scratch that surface a little bit, you get to the deeper idea, why don't I think that people should be able to say any racist thing they want? Well, because I think it's harmful, and I think it's hurtful, and I think it affects... What's that?
empathy and altruism are the things that get you there.
Yeah. I mean,
Underlying, but not actually a belief in freedom.
yeah. So affect and emotion as opposed to concepts and philosophy. Is that where you're going? Yeah. Maybe. I think those things interact maybe a little more. I don't think you can separate them completely and say it's all affect and emotion and no ideas in philosophy. I think there are people for whom they have a master value, right? They really do believe that there is some value out there that they're attached to. And then when the new circumstance pops up, a new case, a new conflict, sometimes they react to it emotionally, and that's your story. And sometimes they apply their master value and say, you know what, I just think freedom is the way to start to view the issues that are out there in the world. And that's the first thing I use to apply my logic to what I'm seeing. So those things aren't mutually exclusive.
So when you started talking about the different types of freedom and how they compete against one another, wasn't earth-shattering in just the general debate sense, but it really changed the way that I always framed debates like this before, which wasn't a competition of different freedoms, but I always thought of it as a competition between freedom and control.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed that we really didn't talk about, when we were kind of dancing around, we never actually used words very often like a right to feel secure or a right to, just to be safe. So I'm just wondering if you, where does this idea of security and safety fit into the discussion? Is that just a freedom to security and safety, or is that another debate, another part of the discussion?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess I see those kinds of things. So when I was talking about freedom of movement, right, that's where I introduced this notion that the arguments for freedom of movement are more typically appeals to what you might think of as values, right? Human dignity, rule of law, those sorts of things. The arguments against freedom of movement are generally not couched in terms of values, unless you stretch the concept of values, right? They're couched in terms of, this is hurting our economy. This is hurting our security. It's a threat. So you could shape those, mold those in the direction of a right to feel secure or safe, but they're not quite, maybe a value of social order would be about as close as you could get. So, some of these things, I guess, you could take issue with the notion of how do you apply values to these debates. And, Stuart's direction was, I don't think this is about values. I think this is about affect and emotion and instinct and gut reactions. And I think the direction you're going is, maybe this isn't about values, but it's about benefits, cost-benefit analysis, right? We're now under threat, we might get shot. Or this is draining our economy, I have to pay more in taxes, right? So those are other ways you could take this discussion. And I think those things probably do factor in to these big debates. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Fantastic.
Thank you.